Hello, and welcome to Sims and Stories. If you like the calming watch of Sims 4 gameplay and you enjoy short stories, then you're in the right place, my friend. It's time to sit down, grab a drink, snuggle up and listen. This is the house on Barrow Street. Let's begin.
London, 1894. The air was thick with fog that December, the sort that seems to swallow lamplight whole and press against the lungs. It crept down the narrow alleys, slithered along the Thames, and settled in the bones of those who dared stay out past dusk. I had come to London from the quiet coast of Devon with a single suitcase, a notebook, and the firm belief that a writer could build a new life through ink and nerve alone. I was wrong. My name is Eveline Harrow. I had once written small moody tales for the weekly periodicals, stories of haunted corridors, strange inheritances, the melancholy of forgotten women. They were not bestsellers, but they paid the rent and gave my solitude a name. Yet after my last story, The Widow's Manuscript, I found I could no longer write. It was as if the very thing that had once poured through me had turned to dust. And then came the letter. It arrived on thin cream paper, sealed with red wax, and addressed in an elegant, unfamiliar hand. Miss Eveline Harrow, 3, Holborn Row, London. Inside was an invitation, or perhaps a summons. Madam, your work has been admired from afar. I believe we share an interest in stories of truth disguised as fiction. I would be honoured if you would visit my home on Barrow Street for a private commission, one of utmost discretion and literary sensitivity. Yours sincerely, Silas Finch. The name meant nothing to me then, though I would come to know it too well. At the time, I felt only a thrill, that peculiar mix of dread and excitement that sits behind the ribs when one senses a story waiting. Barrow Street was not a place I had ever been. It sat in the older part of the city, near the river's bend, narrow, uneven, and dimly lit. I went there 2 evenings later, clutching the letter in my gloved hand. The fog was heavy, blurring the gas lamps into trembling orbs. The house itself was narrow, tall, with a single unlit window on the top floor. The number, 17 Barrow Street, was carved faintly into the stone lintel. The knocker, cold and heavy, was shaped like a raven's head. When I struck it, the sound seemed swallowed before it reached the air. Moments later, the door opened to a man in a dark suit. Not Silas Finch, but a servant of some sort. Thin as a quill, expressionless. He did not speak, merely inclined his head and motioned for me to enter. The hall smelled faintly of ink and smoke. Candles burned low in sconces that hadn't been polished in years. Portraits lined the corridor, faces half lit, half shadowed, their eyes catching the flame as I passed. "Mr. Finch?" I asked softly. "Mr. Finch is in the study," the servant said at last. "He has been waiting." The study was large, panelled in dark oak, with books stacked in precarious towers. At its centre sat Silas Finch, a man of perhaps 50, with grey at his temples and the restless fingers of one who lives in thought. He rose when I entered, bowing slightly. "Miss Harrow, you honour me. I have followed your stories with great admiration. You understand the machinery of secrets, the subtle terror of truth revealed too late." I thanked him, uncertain. "I wish to hire you," he continued, "to write a story for me, or rather, about me. A confession, disguised as fiction. I am a collector of lost truths. There is one in particular that I cannot die with." He smiled, though it did not reach his eyes. "I will pay you generously. You will write what I tell you, exactly as I remember it. No alterations, no names changed. Only then will the story serve its purpose. I asked him what that purpose was. To unburden me, he said, and to bind you. The last words lingered. Bind you. As though he'd already decided something I hadn't agreed to. Still, the prospect of a commission, and one so strange, was irresistible. I accepted. Over the weeks that followed, I returned to the house on Barrow Street again and again. Each visit began the same way. The silent servant at the door, the cold air of the study, the voice of Silas Finch recounting, piece by piece, the fragments of his story. At first it seemed ordinary enough. A man haunted by a youthful mistake, a death never spoken of, a letter misplaced. Yet the more he spoke, the more the details began to feel too precise. The location of a room I'd never seen. The description of a woman who looked impossibly like me. I began to dream of that woman. I would wake with her name, Clara Vale, on my tongue, though Finch had never spoken it aloud. One night I found a drawer left ajar in the study while Finch fetched tea. Inside were manuscripts, dozens of them, all written in my own hand. At least it looked like mine, the same looping script, the same precise punctuation. The titles chilled me. The Widow's Manuscript, The House by the River, The Ghost in the Mirror, all stories I had already written. But beneath them were others I had not. The Murder of Clara Vale, Eveline's Confession, the final chapter. When Finch returned, I shut the drawer quickly. He said nothing, though his eyes flicked once toward the desk, and I knew he had seen. That evening, as I left the house, the servant pressed something into my hand, a folded scrap of paper, damp with sweat. I didn't open it until I reached the street. It read, "Leave while you still remember who you are." The fog closed around me like a fist. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound in my lodging, the creak of floorboards, the hiss of gas, felt amplified, watchful. By dawn, I decided I would confront Finch and end the commission. But when I arrived at Barrow Street the next day, the house was shuttered. The knocker was gone. The number 17 had been scratched out, the stone beneath it raw and flaking. I knocked anyway. No answer. And yet, faintly from somewhere inside, I thought I heard a sound. A pen scratching against paper. A woman's voice whispering words I couldn't quite catch. I left, half running, the fog following me like smoke from a fire that hadn't been extinguished. For 3 days I tried to forget it, but my mind, my hand, betrayed me. When I sat to write, my pen moved without thought. Words poured out, sentences I didn't recognize but could not stop. They told of a woman who had once been hired by a stranger to write his confession. A woman who had entered a house that did not exist. A woman who never came back. When I looked down, the ink had pooled into my name, Eveline Harrow, signed beneath a story I didn't remember writing. That was the moment I realized something terrible. The stories Silas Finch collected were not tales at all. They were people. Each manuscript I had seen in his drawer was not fiction, but transcription, the memories, voices, and souls of those he had drawn in. And now somehow I was next. I did not write again for several days, but the house did not leave me. It waited behind my eyes. Even the city itself seemed to reshape around it. Every lamplit corner bending toward Barrow Street, every whisper in the fog carrying the same refrain. Finish the story. By the end of the week, I surrendered. I went back. The street was there now, as if it had never vanished, the brass numbers freshly polished, the raven-head knocker gleaming like an open eye. When I touched it, the metal felt warm, almost pulsing. The door gave way without sound. The same servant greeted me, or rather, the same shape of one. His face was colourless, as though carved from smoke. "Mr. Finch is expecting you," he said. His voice had the timbre of a page turning. Inside, the house seemed larger. The corridor stretched farther than it had before. The candles burned with a still, unnatural flame. The air smelled of iron and violets. Silas Finch stood by the hearth, waiting. He looked neither older nor younger, but emptier, as if some layer of humanity had been peeled away. "You returned," he said, and his smile was both relief and possession. I told him I wanted the truth, all of it. No more performances, no more dictations. He regarded me for a long time before speaking. "The truth, Miss Harrow, is that stories are hungrier than people. We feed them what we remember, and in time they remember us better than we remember ourselves. You of all people should know that." He gestured toward the desk. A single manuscript lay open, the first page blank, the rest written in that same looping script that imitated mine. "I have given you everything," he said. "Now you must write the ending." I told him I didn't know how. "Then the house will teach you." He left me there with the quill and the waiting silence. I sat. I stared at the page until the candle sputtered. Then, slowly, the nib began to move. The words came as if whispered from behind my shoulder. The woman returned to the house that remembered her. The walls breathed, the ink glistened, and she understood that she had never left. I dropped the pen. The letters on the page continued to form themselves, line by line, without my hand. Each stroke sounded faintly like footsteps. When I looked up, the corridor beyond the door was full of faces. The same faces, from the portraits in the hall. Their eyes were no longer painted. They were watching. The servant stepped forward, his expression serene. "Every confession must have a witness," he said. And then I understood. Silas Finch was not merely a man. He was a vessel, the voice through which the house spoke. Each story he collected was a life absorbed, each confession another brick in its foundation. I fled. Down the twisting stair, past the portraits, through the front door that refused to open. The fog outside pressed against the glass like a living thing. Behind me I could hear the steady scratch of a pen. "Finish it," Finch called softly, "or it will finish you." The candles went out. Darkness folded over me. When I woke, I was in my own lodging, the morning light pale and colourless. My clothes were damp with fog, my hands stained with ink. On the desk lay the manuscript, the same one from Barrow Street, complete, bound, my name, across the title page, "The House on Barrow Street," by Eveline Harrow. I told myself it was a dream. I tried to burn the pages, but the fire refused to take them. The paper blackened, then healed, leaving the words intact. I sent it away instead, to a publisher I barely knew, and told myself I would forget. But forgetting is a luxury of the innocent. The book appeared 6 months later. It sold more copies than anything I had written. Critics called it too vivid to be invention. I told no one that I could not remember writing a single line of it. And then the letters began. They came from strangers who said they had seen the house. A widow in Kensington swore she had passed it on a fog-thick night and heard my voice reciting words from the book. A clerk from the docks claimed he'd rented a room there, though when he returned the next day, the street was gone. Each letter ended the same way. Do you hear the writing at night? I began to. A faint, continuous scratching from behind the walls, as if someone were copying every thought I had. Sleep fled. Food turned to ash. The mirror in my room began to distort. Not the glass, but the reflection. When I leaned close, I saw not my own eyes, but his. Silas Finch, calm, patient, waiting. I went to the police, though I hardly knew what to tell them. They sent a constable with me to find the address. We searched the Riverside quarter for hours, turning street after street, until finally he said, "There is no Barrow Street, miss." There hasn't been for 50 years. It burned. He showed me a patch of wasteland behind a rusted gate, blackened. On the charred ground lay a piece of scorched brass, the shape of a raven's head. That night, back in my lodging, I tried one last time to write my own story. Something new, something not haunted. But when I dipped my pen, the ink bled across the page to form the same words again. The house on Barrow Street. I do not fight it anymore. I write because the house demands it, and because I am no longer certain where I end and the story begins. Perhaps that is what Silas meant by binding. Not chains, but words. The kind that tighten each time they are spoken. Sometimes in the quiet before dawn, I hear footsteps on the stair. I tell myself it is the wind. I tell myself the servant will not knock. But always, always, I hear the soft tap of metal against wood, the raven calling me back. If you ever find a manuscript with my name upon it, unread and unfinished, do not open it. For the story is still hungry, and it remembers every reader. It remembers you now.
London did not notice when Eveline Harrow vanished. It never notices such things at first. The city is built on absences. Windows are shuttered, doors closed, carriages pass with curtains drawn, and one more missing woman sinks quietly into the soot and rumour of the streets. Yet among the small fraternity of writers who fed the penny presses and the monthly reviews, her name lingered like perfume after a guest has gone. A few spoke of her new manuscript, The House on Barrow Street, that had appeared in print only weeks before she was last seen. Others whispered that she had lost her reason, that her imagination had devoured her whole. But one man, a young reviewer named Jonas Liddell, could not leave the matter alone. He had met her once briefly at a publisher's dinner. She had spoken little, but her eyes, grey and watchful, had fixed on him as though she recognized something in him that he had not yet learned about himself. When news of her disappearance reached him, he felt a peculiar guilt, as if he had been expected to stop her from walking into whatever darkness had claimed her. In the damp evenings that spring, Jonas walked the Riverside quarters searching for Barrow Street. He found nothing on the official maps, nothing in the postal registries. When he asked cabmen, they shook their heads. Yet one night, in a public house near Blackfriars, an old woman polishing glasses looked up at his question and said, "Aye, there was a Barrow Street once, burned in the winter of '45. Whole row went down. No one's built there since." She said no more, but her hand trembled slightly as she poured his ale. That should have been the end of it. But the next morning, a parcel arrived at Jonas's lodgings, wrapped in brown paper and sealed with red wax. There was no return address, only his name, written in a looping, unfamiliar hand. Inside lay a book, The House on Barrow Street, and between its pages, an envelope containing a single sheet of paper. On it, in the same ink, were 4 words, "She is not gone." Jonas told himself it was some cruel literary prank, yet as he turned the pages, he felt a rising unease. The story was written in the third person, yet certain passages described rooms he had seen in his own dreams. Narrow staircases, wallpaper patterned with faint ravens, a clock that never struck the hour it showed. Each chapter seemed to shift as he read, sentences rearranging themselves when he looked away. By the third night, he had ceased to sleep. He heard scratching behind the wainscot, faint as quills moving across parchment. Once, waking suddenly, he found the book open on his chest, though he was certain he had left it on the desk. On the 5th night, he decided to destroy it. He carried the volume to the fire and fed it into the coals. The paper curled and blackened, then uncurled again, pale and whole, the letters bright as fresh ink. From somewhere deep within the house came the hollow sound of a door unlatching. He turned, heart hammering. At the end of the corridor, a dim light glowed where there should have been only plaster wall. A passage now stood open, narrow, unfamiliar, smelling faintly of damp paper and smoke. He stepped forward, the floorboards sighing beneath him. Beyond the threshold was a staircase descending into shadow, and there, faintly, he thought he heard a woman's voice murmuring. Not words exactly, but the rhythm of them, the cadence of writing spoken aloud. Jonas took a candle and began to follow. The stair wound downward like the inside of a shell, every step sighing as though it remembered other feet. The walls closed in until Jonas had to tilt the candle sideways to keep it from burning his sleeve. The air smelled of mildew and printer's ink, sharp and faintly sweet. When he reached the bottom, he found himself in a narrow corridor lined with shelves. Books filled them, hundreds of them, their spines blank, their pages uncut. Each was bound in the same pale leather that darkened at his touch. The candlelight trembled. The air did not move. At the far end of the corridor, a door stood ajar. From within came the slow, deliberate scratch of a pen. Jonas pushed the door wider. The room beyond was not large, but its proportions were wrong. The ceiling too low, the corners lost in gloom. A desk stood at the center, and on the desk a single open book. Beside it sat a figure in a dark gown, her head bowed as she wrote. The candle on the desk burned with a steady blue flame. "Miss Harrow." The name escaped him before he could think. The woman did not turn, but the pen stopped moving. For a moment, there was only the faint drip of wax. Then very quietly, she said, "You should not be here." The voice was Eveline's, but different, emptied of warmth, measured as a heartbeat. Jonas took another step. The floor creaked, and the shelves that lined the walls shivered as if something passed between them. "They said you were gone," he whispered. "I am written," she replied, "and what is written does not go." She lifted her face then, and he saw that her eyes reflected no light. On the page before her, his own name had begun to appear, letter by letter, in that same curling script. He reached for the book. "Who is doing this?" "The house," she said simply. "It remembers every word ever spoken within its walls." When we write, we lend it breath. When we read, we open its mouth. Jonas backed away. The candle in his hand sputtered, throwing wild shadows across the room. Behind Eveline, a door he had not noticed before was beginning to open. From the darkness beyond came a dry rustling, like many pages turning at once. He turned and ran. The corridor seemed longer than before. He could feel the shelves pressing closer, the unseen volumes whispering against one another as he passed. When he reached the stair, it spiraled upward into a distance that should not have existed. The candle had burned to a stub. The sound of writing followed him, rising like a storm. He burst into the corridor of his lodging house, the candle extinguished, the air cold and ordinary. The door behind him was gone. In its place hung his own coat. For a long time he stood motionless, his heart hammering. Then he looked down. In his hand was the book he had tried to burn. The pages were no longer blank. The story now told of a man named Jonas Liddell, who had gone searching for a missing writer and found her. It ended mid-sentence. That night he wrote a letter to his editor, enclosing the manuscript. He intended never to see it again. But when he awoke, the letter lay sealed beside the bed, addressed in another hand to a name he did not know, and faintly, from behind the wall, came the sound of a pen beginning a new page. Morning rose over London like a bruise, the colour of soot and old paper. The fog lay thick across the river, muffling the bells of St. Clement's and making the gas lamps glow like dying embers. In the upper room of his lodging house, Jonas Liddell sat unmoving, staring at the manuscript that had returned to him. Every attempt to destroy it had failed. Ink bled back onto the page, no matter how he tore or burned. Each time the story resumed exactly where it had left off, as though it resented interruption. He had not slept. He could still hear the faint scratching through the wall, the steady rhythm of a pen describing words he could not yet see. He told himself it was a neighbor, though he knew the rooms beyond his own had been empty since winter. At noon, he wrapped the book in newspaper and carried it through the fog to Fleet Street. He meant to hand it to the police, but instead his steps led him toward the office of the London Spectator, where Eveline had once delivered her essays. The building was closed for renovation, windows blind with plaster dust. On the locked door, someone had scrawled in chalk a single line: "The written word endures where flesh forgets." He turned away quickly, heart pounding, and nearly collided with a young woman who had emerged from the fog carrying a parcel of proofs. She was pale and freckled, her gloves ink-stained. "Are you Mr. Liddell?" she asked. "Miss Harrow told me to expect you." Jonas froze. "Miss Harrow has been dead these 6 weeks." The woman blinked. "I only know the message was delivered yesterday." She handed him an envelope sealed with black wax. Inside was a key and a slip of paper bearing an address: Barrow Street, number 11, the same house he had fled. He almost dropped it, but curiosity, that oldest sin of writers, tightened its claws. By dusk he found himself once again at the threshold of the house. The door yielded at once, as though the lock had been waiting for the key to remember him. The interior was unchanged. Dust lay thick on the floorboards, yet no cobwebs clung to the ceiling. The air smelled faintly of violets and something colder beneath. He climbed the staircase. The wallpaper pulsed faintly, like parchment drawing breath. In the study, the blue-flamed candle still burned, though no wax had melted. The chair was empty. On the desk lay a new book, its title stamped in gilt, The Inheritance of Silence, by Eveline Harrow and Jonas Liddell. He opened it. The first chapter described his morning in exact detail, down to the chalk words on Fleet Street and the freckled girl in the fog. The second had begun already, though no hand was visible upon the page. Sentences formed themselves, patient and deliberate. He stands once more within the house, holding the book that holds him. Jonas felt the floor tilt gently. His reflection in the window wavered, and for an instant another figure stood beside him. A woman in a dark gown, her hair unbound, her eyes two deep wells of ink. She looked at him not with malice, but with weary recognition. The window shuddered. Beyond the glass, London blurred, its streets twisting into patterns like script. Every building, every alley became a line in some vast, unwritten text. The city itself was a manuscript, and Barrow Street, the quill poised above it. He understood then that the house was not haunted in the ordinary sense. It was alive with narrative, a creature that fed on words and repaid them with permanence. Eveline had given it her voice. Now it sought his. He tried to speak, but found no breath. Only ink flowed from his mouth, from his fingertips, staining the floor in restless lines. The house sighed, content. When the fog lifted 3 days later, the landlord found the room empty. The desk was bare, save for a single closed volume. Its dedication read, "To the next author who hears the scratching through the wall." He left it there and let the door be locked. Yet on certain nights, when the wind moves through the chimneys of Bloomsbury, a whisper can still be heard, the faint rhythm of a pen describing another name. And those who pause to listen too long sometimes find the whisper answering from within their own rooms. By the turn of spring, the fog no longer lifted. It lay across the city like a great folded sheet, swallowing the gaslight and muting the bells. The river ran black beneath its skin, and the few who walked the quays at night swore they could hear whispering beneath the arches, as though London were murmuring to itself. At first, the stories appeared in newspapers, printers whose presses ran on after midnight, typesetters who found whole columns rearranged into passages they had not composed. Then the booksellers began to speak of a title that arrived without order or invoice, The Inheritance of Silence, bound in pale leather, unsigned, yet bearing the names Eveline Harrow and Jonas Liddell. No publisher could say where it had come from. Each copy was slightly different, and each who read it claimed to recognize their own handwriting somewhere in its pages. Within weeks, the city's readers began to change. They would pause mid-sentence and glance to the door, listening for the faint scratch of a pen. Some wrote letters they did not remember composing. Others woke to find their mirrors filmed with words that vanished when touched. The contagion of narrative had found its audience. In a garret near Holborn, a young poet named Clara Venn purchased one of the books from a street vendor. She had heard of Eveline Harrow, the reclusive essayist whose disappearance had been a brief sensation. Clara opened the volume by candlelight. The first line trembled before her eyes. The city dreams through the mind of whoever reads these words. She smiled at the conceit and read on. Outside, the fog shifted, gathering against the window, as though it listened. With every paragraph, her heart slowed. Her breathing matched the pulse of the sentences. By dawn, she had reached the final page, which ended as all the others did, abruptly, mid-thought. When she looked up, the candle had gone cold. The air smelled faintly of violets. In the mirror above the mantel, her reflection lifted its pen and continued the line. Across the city, others experienced the same. Readers vanished, their rooms left tidy, save for open books. Newspapers began to report it as the Barrow Street phenomenon. Officials confiscated the volumes, but more appeared. They multiplied like rumors, their bindings seeping through the damp of library shelves. The city itself seemed to rearrange. Street signs blurred into script. Rain fell in threads of ink that stained the cobblestones. By midsummer, London was a palimpsest of itself. Voices echoed from the fog, half-remembered phrases of Eveline's prose. Some claimed to see her walking along the embankment, a figure of paper and shadow, her eyes filled with text. Others swore she wrote now through the hands of those who dreamed too vividly. And beneath all this, in the silence that followed every breath of wind, the old house on Barrow Street waited. Its windows were dark, its door unbarred. Yet if one placed an ear against the lintel, a heartbeat could be heard. Slow, deliberate, endless. Each beat a word. Each word a name being written. On the night of the equinox, Clara Venn stood before that door. The book she carried had grown heavier with each page she read, its spine warm as flesh. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The blue flame greeted her like a returning thought. At the desk sat two figures, a man and a woman, their faces turned toward the page. They did not look up as she approached. The room smelled of ink and time. She took her seat between them, opened her notebook, and began to write. Outside, the fog thickened until the street itself was gone. London breathed once, then fell utterly still. A story holding its final pause before the next line. Somewhere, a pen moves again. The next chapter waits for the one who dares to listen.
Thank you for listening to The House on Barrow Street. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing. I'll be posting for you 2 weekly. Sleep tight, Simmers.